So I wanted to continue telling my story about treatment and having hairy cell leukemia. It's actually been a couple of months since I made the last video. So I've actually gone through chemotherapy, I've gone through immunotherapy, and I finished last week. But I did want to come in and make a video about each step of this, talk about what my experience was. This is not necessarily what you should expect, but it is my story. And if it is all helpful, I hope that someone out there can use this information. But basically, as for my last video, I was diagnosed with hairy cell leukemia back on November 5th, I believe was the date. In my last video, I talked a lot about being a good self-advocate, and it was being a good self-advocate is what brought me to my cancer team. And once I was diagnosed, we knew exactly what it was, that it was classic hairy cell leukemia. They wanted me to immediately start chemotherapy, which was Cladrabine. And so I had an appointment on Friday afternoon with my hematologist up at the Colorado Blood Cancer Institute, and they wanted me to start chemotherapy on Wednesday. So they got me in right away, and the treatment for me was a 5 consecutive day infusion of Cladrabine. So I came in on Wednesday morning early and had a small surgical procedure to insert a port, because they wanted to use a port for not only the Cladrabine infusions, but also the coming rituximab infusions. So I came in on Wednesday morning very early, got all my blood tests done, got those back, then found out that my platelets were too low to allow them to do that minor surgery to insert the port. So I actually had to receive a blood transfusion that morning. Actually, I got 2. Actually, let me rephrase that. I didn't get blood transfusions. I got platelet infusions, and I ended up getting 2. So it took me 2 to 3 hours total, and basically because they did 1 platelet infusion, then they checked my blood after that, checked the platelets. They still weren't as high as they wanted them to be. I started out, my platelets were around 26, so really, really low, and they wanted them above 50. Now, after the first infusion or transfusion of platelets, I ended up like 48, 49, so they gave me another one. And after that, they didn't even check. They knew I would be above 50, which was their threshold. And then I went in, had the surgical procedure to put in the port, and then from there went straight up to the infusion center to get my first dose of Cladrabine. And I got to be honest with you, I was really scared to death. And I think we all would be and will be when you're going in. This is a big deal, getting chemotherapy. We don't know what it's going to do to us. My hematologist, I think, did a pretty good job of preparing me. He told me that I'd likely keep my hair, which I did. Now, that being said, I did experience, and I don't know if it's from the chemotherapy or from the immunotherapy, I have experienced a thinning, which I don't love, but I still have most of my hair. And hopefully once all the immunotherapy gets out of my body, maybe I might get some of the fullness back, but I still have, probably 80% of what I started with, so not too bad. So we did the chemotherapy, which, they come in, they put, the needle into the port, which actually I'd previously gotten the needle in the port for the blood transfusions or the platelet transfusions. So they just left it and they just hooked up to that. The chemotherapy took like 90 minutes for, to put the dose in, and then you go home. And now I'm 2 hours from the infusion center. And so I had it late that afternoon. I needed to be back the next morning in Denver for the next one. But I went home, drove back the next day, got a friend to drive me, and went and had the second infusion of Cladrabine. And then through a series of events during that day, nothing of importance, but just took time. I didn't get finished until about 4 o'clock on day 2. and I drove all the way back home 2 hours, 2+ hours because of rush hour traffic in Denver. Ended up home at 7, but I had to be back in Denver the next morning at 7 a.m. because that's when I was scheduled the next day. They were kind of trying to fit me in because literally, this is within a week of the diagnosis. I was not part of their normal schedule of people coming in and getting chemotherapy. So I got up super early the next morning, and I was exhausted by this point. I mean, I'd been traveling, been getting chemotherapy, getting up early again, and had a friend drive me up to Denver on day 3, which is Friday, and got the chemotherapy then. And largely, though, now I've had 3 doses of chemotherapy, and other than being really tired, which honestly, frankly, is probably more from driving back and forth to Denver every day than actually from the chemotherapy. I'd be getting home, I'd be exhausted and tired because of a long day, get some sleep, get up early the next morning, drive back to Denver. In retrospect, that was stupid on my part. I should have just gotten a hotel room up in Denver and just stayed, for those days. I got a related experience to you, though, which is I woke up Sunday morning. So I had 3 days of chemotherapy, and the weekend they don't work, so we took those days off. So Saturday, no chemo. Sunday, I get up and I feel good. I mean, you have those mornings where you just wake up and you feel good. I felt good. I felt great, and I had tears well up. I went in, I was sleeping in a separate bedroom from my wife just because I was tossing and turning a lot, and I didn't want to keep her awake. So I went in and woke her up. She saw the tears in my eyes, asked what's going on, and I said, I feel so blessed right now because I feel good. I feel really, really good, and ultimately that was what chemo was for me. It was kind of a nothing burger. I went back to Denver on Monday, had chemo then. I got a hotel that night, having learned my lesson from the other days, and then came back and got my 5th and final infusion of Cladrabine. And my understanding with Cladrabine, depending on where you are in the world and how they administer it, I was prescribed 5 consecutive days by infusion. There are some people that will be put in the hospital depending on what their situation is and what their doctors want to do. They're actually put into the hospital and do a 7-day drip of Cladrabine. I'm glad I didn't have to do that. I've heard in the UK that they actually do just injections. They don't do infusions. They just inject you with it, send you home. And from what I understand, the efficacy of all 3 of these are all about the same. So it might just be what your doctors do, what is available to you, or what they're willing to do. Infusions are more expensive than getting an injection, I would assume. Maybe that's why the UK does it that way. But anyway, for me, chemo, the actual getting of chemo was a big nothing burger for me. I had no side effects whatsoever. I had no nausea. Like I said, I didn't really lose hair from it per se. Like I said, I've lost a little, but I don't know what it's from, and it's no big deal compared to what other people have to go through with other types of cancer and other types of treatments. Now, that being said, I had no side effects, but there are direct effects of Cladrabine and chemotherapy. And those direct effects don't raise their head for about 2 or 3 weeks. And what those direct effects are is that, and this is supposed to happen because what they're doing with Cladrabine is they're attacking the cells in your bone marrow. And they're killing off the cancer cells, but they're also killing off the few good cells that you have in there. I had an 80% ratio of abnormal cells to regular cells. So 80% of my cells were cancerous and only 20% were the good ones. But it goes after and tries to kill them all. So what ultimately happens is your white blood cell count, your red blood cell count, your hemoglobin, your neutrophils, they all just plummet. And 3 weeks approximately after finishing chemotherapy, I was really, really struggling. And I was struggling when people talk about the fatigue of chemotherapy. I know what it means now. At least I know what it meant for me. What it meant for me was that I was very anemic. My hemoglobin was extremely low, to the point of where I needed 4 blood transfusions over 2 days just to get me back up into a halfway normal level. My hemoglobin a couple times was down in the 6 range or low 7s, and I got infusions from that. Also, because of the really massively depressed immune system, I started spiking or getting what are called neutropenic fevers. And neutropenic fevers are basically non-infectious fevers that your body is throwing essentially because your immune system's messed up. And for the most case for me, these were low-grade fevers. They were all below 100 degrees, except for one day. One day, I spiked a fever of 101.2, and they told me anything over 100.5 to go to the hospital. So I did go to the hospital, but I went to the nearest hospital, not the one in Denver that's associated with my cancer center. And ultimately, they admitted me. And by the time I got to the hospital, I was below 100.5. It had gone back down, and I hadn't treated it. They didn't want me to treat fevers because they want to see the actual number. And then they were looking for sources of infection, which is what they're supposed to do. So they ran a ton of tests looking for all kinds of things, looking for COVID, looking for flu, looking for viruses, bacteria, etc. Ultimately, they found none. But the oncologist at that hospital, along with the internists, they looked at my numbers and saw that my absolute neutrophil count was around 30, which is like 0.003 when they say 30. It's really, really low. But I'd been low, actually, for months. I'd been very low. And I got even lower after the Cladrabine, but they didn't want to let me out of the hospital, even though I had no infection. And I had an issue with this because first off is you're more likely to catch an infection in a hospital and I was on the infectious disease ward, so it's a place where they put people who are very immune compromised. So it wasn't really infectious disease wards. I guess it's those who are at high risk of infectious disease ward. And they took, great care, great caution. Everybody wore masks, a lot of gloves and things like that. But ultimately, I felt like I was probably a bit more risk there than I was at home. So I talked with my cancer team up in Denver and asked them to talk to the team there because I was scheduled to go back I had already started immunotherapy at that point, and I was scheduled to go back on Monday for immunotherapy, which I did once a week. And I did not want to miss that appointment. I went out on Thursday to the hospital, and they still weren't letting me out by Saturday, and I started really pushing about getting out. And they couldn't get the internist to sign off on it because there was one test that was abnormal that was likely caused by bacteria on my skin, not in my body. But they needed to rerun that test, a culture, and the cultures take 2 to 3 days to get the results out of. And I didn't want to spend another 2 to 3 days in the hospital to find out what was likely at that time, which was that it was skin bacteria, not anything inside the body. So ultimately, I did talk them into releasing me on Sunday. And at this point, I had no fevers, and I was fine, felt fine, and they did let me go home. That was my only hospitalization. From what I've read, there's a lot of people who get hospitalized for long periods of time. And I talked to the oncologist there when they first said, well, we want to keep you in until your neutrophils get to an acceptable level. My immediate question for him is, well, what do you mean when you say acceptable? And what she said was 1,000, which would be 0.1. Or no, it'd be 1.0. Yeah, 1.0. And at that point, I was at 0.003. I was at 30. They wanted me to get to 1,000. I would have been in the hospital for weeks had that happened. And the reason they want to do that is because when your neutrophils are low, it means that you're at very high risk of infection. And I understand that, but I feel like that I am safer at home with my wife with no other exposure than my wife, and then just going to Denver to the cancer ward where they're taking precautions once a week to get my other infusions. Ultimately, I was able to talk them into that. But then again, what are we back to? Being your own best advocate. Be your own best advocate. Talk to your team. And if you can, now, like I said, I went to a hospital that was different than the one that my cancer team was on because it was closer. And in retrospect, I think that was a mistake. I probably should have taken the extra hour and driven all the way to Denver and gone to the hospital associated with my cancer team. That way they were the ones directing the care. And anyway, it ultimately, I did get out. Spent 3 days in the hospital, and it wasn't horrible, 3 days, but anything longer than that, I think it would have started to grate on me. And also, the hospital I was in was 45 minutes away from my home, so it was a burden on my family as well to try to come and be with me and still be at home, take care of the pets. And so, anyway, from a chemotherapy standpoint, that low point was when I was very anemic, and my blood levels were very low. And what that meant for me was that I would walk up the stairs and my heart rate would go to 145 just walking up the stairs. Just getting up and walking across the room, it would go to 125, 130. Resting heart rate was 110. And that's all because of being anemic, having the hemoglobins be very low. Heart has to work harder in order to get oxygen, to all of your organs and to get it to your muscles. But that's the fatigue part, is you can't believe that just walking up the stairs will wipe you out, and you'll be puffing like you just walked the stadium steps, even though you just walked 10 steps from downstairs to upstairs. The transfusions helped, but ultimately the only thing that really helped was when the numbers rebounded. And it took me about 2 to 3 weeks to finally have my numbers rebound. And when they did, it was obvious. And when you looked at the charts and the graphs, there'd be this line like this going, from really low when I started, when I had my diagnosis, because you start with very low numbers, but then they get worse and they go down to near zero down here. But then they spiked and went straight up, like within a week, into the normal range for me. But once they hit the normal range, I felt fine. Now, I had other side effects from immunotherapy that I'll talk about in the next video, but for the chemotherapy, for me, no nausea, really not even tiredness. I was fine. I had issues sleeping. That was probably the only thing. I did have insomnia, which I am not an insomniac. I am not. I'm one of those special people in the world that I go to bed, I close my eyes, and I go to sleep. And it's a wonderful gift that was taken from me during chemotherapy for probably a week to two, no, longer than that, more than 2 weeks. I really struggled getting to sleep and then staying asleep. Once I finally got to sleep, I might only sleep for 2 hours and then I'd wake up. The only thing that really helped there was, and by the way, they prescribed me trazodone, which it's actually a mental health drug, but one of the effects of it allegedly is that it helps you sleep. It did not help me sleep. It actually gave me weird kind of psychotic dreams that I woke up from because they were so disturbing. And I have a family member who's a psychiatrist, and I called him and said, "Hey, trazodone, does that cause crazy kind of, really, really crazy dreams, that almost hallucinogenic type experience?" And his response was, "Well, yeah, that's actually why I don't prescribe trazodone anymore, because 25% of the people get that." And I stopped taking it immediately. I called my doctor and I stopped taking it immediately. And instead, they gave me hydroxyzine, which is an antihistamine, but a prescription strength antihistamine that makes you very sleepy. That helped a lot. That's really all I need. I just need something to help make me sleepy. So I started using the hydroxyzine, and that worked really well. And when the hydroxyzine wore off, if I woke up in the middle of the night, I wouldn't take more hydroxyzine because it's stronger. I would actually just go take a couple of Benadryl. And again, that also helped me with some of the side effects of the immunotherapy. So anyway, that's the chemotherapy story for me. Cladrabine, it's 5 days in a row, and it's amazing that that's it. I have friends with cancer, other types of cancer, that do months of chemotherapy and do a dozen or more or 30 treatments of chemotherapy. It's 5 days and you're done. And for some people, that's the only treatment that they get for hairy cell leukemia. For me, they opted, and I agreed with, doing both chemotherapy and immunotherapy because the hope there is you get a longer duration of remission. So next video I'm going to do, I'm going to wear the same shirt, but I wanted to break these up because I'm going to do it right now. I want to talk about the immunotherapy and Rituxan. So that'll be next. So thanks all for who are following my journey, my story, and I hope it's helpful to someone.